Well, hello, beautiful world. My name is Alexandra Van Zeelandt. You may be wondering what you're doing here, but this is a show about loving and accepting yourself and choosing to heal. Because, like so many, I have struggled through life feeling as if I was alone in my pain, that my trauma shaped me into something that no one would ever be able to understand. I thought that the game of life had been rigged against me, and I was spiritually bankrupt in its casino. I know what it's like to get on my knees and scream, "God, can you hear me?" I know what it's like to watch my family fall apart. I know what it's like to numb yourself until there's nothing left of you. From the bottom of my heart and through my own life experiences, I'm here to tell you that you're not alone. You never were. I'm here to tell you that you are whole and complete right now in this very moment. In your darkness, there is light. There is not one part of you that is incomplete in this moment. Now, I'm not a life coach. I'm not a therapist. I don't hide behind a paywall. I want to inspire you to love yourself more than the limiting beliefs you've let control you. And I'm going to face my fear right now because episode 1, it's about everything that I survived. Every dark secret is coming to light today because I want you to know who I am. So I'm going to put a trigger warning here because some of the things that I'm going to discuss are very uncomfortable, and I want to practice every thing that I preach because I know I'm not alone. Contrary to everything that I believed previously, I am not alone in my pain. Healing is never comfortable, but it does get easier. And I promise you that everything will be okay. Welcome to Trauma Bonding, and this is episode 1. For a little bit of background, my mother married a man she didn't love. And it's something that I've blamed myself for my whole life. That she married my father because she was pregnant with me. Now, that doesn't mean that she didn't want me. I was so very wanted, but I guess this was her only opportunity. She was 33. She had gone on a couple dates with him. She wasn't the type of person to just bang anybody. And finally, I was there. I was a part of her. When my mother gave birth to me, I had become the love that was missing in their marriage. And it's not that she didn't try to love my father. My mother was one of the most intelligent people you would have ever met. And my father was a Brooklyn Cro-Magnon. If she were here, she would say he is dumb to the bone. Pinocchio. Little wooden head with eyes that shine. She tried to make it work because she believed that every child deserved to have a father. But I also believe that she felt that she couldn't do it alone. I think she was scared to be a single mother. And in her attempt to make the marriage work, she started to think to herself, what can I do with him? And as she got to know him, she learned that he could fix anything, that he was a gifted plumber, electrician, carpenter. Whatever your house needed, he could do it by himself. So my mother made the decision to get into business with my father. And month by month, the business grew to the point that they had to hire people. And when you go from not having a lot of money to having money, there are things that drastically change. Like I remember as a little kid, a commercial would come on the TV for a new toy. And I would scream in the house, I want that. And wherever my mother was, she would scream back, I'll buy it. And guess who had that toy the next day? We moved into a big, beautiful mansion. Maybe they weren't fighting as often as they were when I was a baby, but there were signs of distortion. I remember my mother coming into my room and sitting on my bed and telling me that she didn't love my father. And how would I feel if I had 2 Christmases and 2 houses? And I cried. I begged her to stay with him. And after I was done crying and pleading my case, she said, okay. A few years passed and my brother was born, and that seemed to have renewed a sense of faith in everyone except myself. I looked at my brother as someone that I had to compete with for love, affection, and attention. But there was one person in my family who was able to see what I was going through, and that was my mother's brother, Uncle Jimmy, who, don't for a second think that we're talking about a Lester the Molester type of situation, okay? It's not like that. My uncle was my world, aside from my mother. My uncle was one of the most brilliant men I have ever met in my life. And my uncle was a heroin addict. Like, I remember the day my mother was on the phone with him, pleading for him to get sober. She gave me the phone and told me to talk to him. And I said, Uncle Jimmy, I don't care if you're a heroin addict. I love you. Everyone loves you. And I didn't care that my uncle had a problem. That could not take away the love that I had for him. I was very fearful that he was going to pass away. And things got bad. But he did try to get sober. And I was just excited that he was coming over to stay with us, because he was going to detox and stay in the guest bedroom. But my mother wouldn't really let me hang out with him during that time. So I waited. A few days. And I remember sneaking into his room. And I walked over to his side of the bed and I yelled, "Surprise!" And he was so sick, he could barely lift his head. But I knew that I could cheer him up. You see, I had the Wizard of Oz in my hand. And he asked me, what do you got there, Tot? I showed him the movie. And I put it in to the VCR and climbed up on the end of the bed. And I remember how frail he was as he tried to get himself situated. And he was gray and clammy. And I said, "Get ready, Uncle Jimmy. It's all going to turn into color." And he said, "No, it's not going to do that." I said, "Just watch. Just watch." And finally, the screen was filled with color. And he had this big smile on his face. My mother walked in and said, "Alexandra, I told you to leave Uncle Jimmy alone." And he said, No, let her stay. We're watching a movie." And that was the last time I ever saw him. Eventually, that train came And my mother got that phone call, and my amazing, amazing uncle was dead. He died. He died with a needle in his arm on the bathroom floor and had been there for a day before he was found. And that's when my life changed. That's when I learned what grief was. And everything would never be the same. A few months later, the nation was hit with a tragedy, and that tragedy was 9/11. And because my father was a electrician and plumber, he was called by the state of New York to work rescue and recovery. You know, it wasn't just pulling out the deceased, but electrical safety. It was a team effort. The state had provided my father with an apartment, and I started to see him less. But when he would come home, he was erratic. His mood swings were difficult for all of us to handle. There was almost like a sense of relief when he would leave. But there was so much going on in our lives that there wasn't a lot of time spent trying to figure out what was wrong with my father. And after a few months, he started making these phone calls to my mother saying that the mafia was after us. And listen, if the mob is gonna whack you, they're not gonna warn you, okay? And my mother knew that, but he was desperate to leave New York. A lot of people felt that way. 9/11 was tragic not just for New Yorkers, but everyone in the tri-state area. And my mother had never been anywhere other than a trip to Sweden, California, Florida, and that's about it. She started to empathize with my father's pleas to start a new life somewhere different. And the promise was if we didn't like it, we could leave in a year and come back home. My mother took great pains to map out exactly where she wanted to live. She wanted to be no more than 30 minutes away from the city of Nashville. She said, look at Franklin, look at Belmead. Gave him a list of all these places. And there was this one house that he was fixated on. It was an old Victorian manor on top of a hill. It was beautiful. It was a powder blue with a red roof, a terrace, a balcony. It was stunning. And my father bought that house on the spot. It looked like a dream house that you would gift a little girl. And when we got there, all of us, all of our shit, when we got to the house, my mother learned that he had moved us 2 hours away from Nashville. That our closest neighbor was Loretta Lynn, 88 acres away, and we were fully isolated and didn't know anybody. And my family and I, with our thick Brooklyn accents, were in the middle of nowhere. My mother commonly referred to it as bumfuck. Where do we live? We live in bumfuck. We were completely alone. And that's when we started to really notice that something was wrong with my father. But as long as he kept his word that he would fix up this place and make it beautiful, that we could go back home in a year. That was the promise. Before we go any further, whew, whew, okay. So there we were in the middle of nowhere. I was 11 and my brother was 5. And it had been a few months since we moved in, a total of 3. My mother hated it and she went to find a job as quickly as she could. She started working at a hotel, I believe in Bellevue. And she enjoyed getting away from Bucksnort, where we resided. School had started. We first tried the public school, and the public school, they paddled kids, which my mother was not about. God forbid anyone that tried to put their hands on my ass, all right? God forbid, because she would have had their head. And she found a Catholic school about 30 minutes away from where we lived. But every day we returned back to that old Victorian manor on the hill. When we were done with our schoolwork, we would ride around on our four-wheelers that my father had purchased. My brother wanted to be like my dad in the worst way. The same way that my mother was my hero was the same way my father was my brother's hero. And even though my dad's behavior was unpredictable, my brother loved him. I loved him, but I felt that my love was only out of necessity. And one day my mother went to work. It was a beautiful day, November 23rd of 2002. My father was on a tractor plowing a field. Who knew we were going to move all the way to Tennessee so my father could become Farmer fucking Fred? But he was on a tractor, and my brother and I were on the four-wheelers. Now, we had these designated paths that we were to stay on. But, as the older sibling, I wanted to explore the field closest to where my father was. And I remember riding over, and out of nowhere, I got propelled forward. And there was, to my surprise, a gully. I took my helmet off, and I cupped my mouth and realized that I was bleeding. Now, my brother, who was tagging along with me, came over and said, what happened? What happened? I said, I bit my lip on the gully. I'm going to go back up to the house. So I told him that he needed to go be with my father over by where the tractor was. And I watched him drive over to the tractor. And once he was with my father, I went back up the hill into the house. I took a shower. About an hour passed, and my mother came home. She asked me where my father and brother were, and I said they're in the field. I went to the car and I helped her unload groceries, and we started to prepare dinner. And then the phone rang. It was my father telling my mother that we needed to get to the closest hospital and that he didn't have time to explain. Now, my brother was a rambunctious little fuck, okay? And I say that lovingly. But my brother was notorious for injuring himself and having to get stitches. Why? The best explanation I can give you is that he is all boy. in about a year, needed to go to the hospital 5 different times for stitches. And I could tell that my mother was worried, but I said, it's just a few stitches. How bad could it be? Once we got to the hospital, we parked next to my father's truck. We made our way into the main entrance of the hospital and told the nurse we were here to see James. And I'll never forget the fear in that woman's face when we told her the name. And she quickly got up from behind the desk and said, "You have to follow me now." And as we made our way into the emergency wing of this tiny little country hospital, it was mayhem. There were nurses running all through the hall going into the first room. There was a doctor trying to shock a little body back to life. And it didn't register to me at first what I was seeing. It only hit me when they started cutting a little Spider-Man shirt off of a body. It was only then when my attention was brought to the monitor, where there was a faint beeping noise. And it went like this until there was a flat line. And my mother screamed. And she ran to my father and started clocking him over and over again. "What did you do to my baby? What did you do to my baby?" And I backed myself up against the wall where there was a chair, crying, realizing I just watched my brother die. Now, miraculously, that doctor was able to get my brother back. His pulse was very faint. It was weak, but he got him back. And once the nurses were able to separate my mother and father, the doctor walked over and told her that there was nothing more that he could do for my brother, that they had called a life flight in, and that he needed to go to Vanderbilt. And my mother was so scared. She was so frantic and scared. The doctor went back in to try and keep my brother as stable as possible. I didn't even recognize my brother because there was blood everywhere. His face was it was flat. My mother and I walked out of the hospital after we were informed that we would not be allowed on the loading deck. But we wanted to see that my brother got lifted off safely. And it was then when this beautiful girl walked over and she grabbed my mother and said, can I pray with you for your son?" She said, "Jesus loves him." She had to have been like maybe 18 at the time, but I remember that when I looked at her, she looked like an angel. She was so beautiful and pure that regardless of why she was at the hospital, She wanted to make sure that we were okay. And we stood there in that parking lot, watching the helicopter go up. And we prayed. And it was really the first time that I had ever prayed like that, you know. I had always had a strong connection with God, but I had never really known how to pray. When we got to the hospital, we were greeted by a team of doctors who needed some explanations. They informed us that my brother had suffered a traumatic brain injury, that he had had 2 strokes, that he broke 3 portions of his skull and every bone in his face with the exception of his jaw. His lungs collapsed, and there was cerebral spinal fluid in them. They said he was in the 1 percentile of survival, the 1 percentile of regaining cognitive function. That's when my father said that he was on a 4-wheeler and he had told him to go back to the house, and he must have gone over the handlebars. They were just as angry that this had happened to such a young child because they had never seen anything like it. They said he had to have been going at least 60 miles an hour, that the helmet saved his life, but they couldn't promise what quality of life he was going to have if he woke up. And as a little girl, I sat in that hospital waiting room watching my mother cry and my father cry. And I remember saying to myself, well, I guess I'm an adult now. That if my brother survived all that attention that I wanted so badly from my mother, I wasn't going to have it. But I'm an adult now, was the thought that I kept having. We went back to see my brother. He was stable, but in a coma. He was unrecognizable. His head had ballooned because of all the pressure. After about 14 days, the doctors informed my parents they needed to perform a major surgery to restore the bones in my brother's face and his skull, and that it would take about 27 hours. One of the doctors said, pick, to my mother. Pick between his sight and his hearing. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. I blamed myself again because I bit my lip and I had to go up to the house. That if I would have stayed with him, that this wouldn't have happened. And even though I was jealous of my brother, even though there was part of me that hated him for just existing, I mourned him. I missed seeing him running around, stealing my toys. I missed his laugh. And all of this was my fault. It took more than a day. I think it became a 32-hour long surgery. And they put my brother's face back together. The only thing was that they had to cut the facial nerve on the left side of my brother's face. Honestly, it didn't matter then because they were able to save him. And they brought him back. The head of neurosurgery started to speak. He went through the spiel again that, wasn't sure if he'd be in a wheelchair the rest of his life, wasn't sure if he was going to be a vegetable. Every nightmare you can think of. And I know that this is going to sound unbelievable, but it was just as unbelievable to witness. Right after the doctor said that, my brother, who was in a coma, picked up his leg and crossed it. And my mom started to scream, "That a boy, James, that a boy. You show him." I have never seen doctors so perplexed in my life. And the head of neuro walked out. It wasn't long before my brother awakened from his coma, and I was really scared to see him. I knew that everything was a little uncertain, but we were going to see if God was real or not. And he had all these bandages around his face, around his head. It looked like a Q-tip. And I guess in the time frame that it took to see him, the people from the rehab had got him a little tricycle, like a little one. And he came around the corner on the bike, pedaling. And he couldn't speak or anything really at this point. But he was awake. And there was my mother in hysterics. There was my father, quiet. And there was me. And our eyes met. And he motioned to me like this. And he gave me a hug and a kiss. And all that shame that I felt for just a second disappeared. Just a second. And then my mother hugged him, and my father hugged him, and the doctors pulled us back and told us that he was going to be going to the rehab facility. And they were very honest that this would be a long recovery process. Then they asked to speak with my mother and father privately. And my mother said, "I don't keep anything from my children. You can speak in front of her." And that's when they gave my mother the news. In order for my brother to recover, the family unit needed to be stable. And what that meant was if she had thought about divorcing my father, that it was imperative for my brother's recovery that they stay together. And my mother was contemplating divorcing my father, but she couldn't. Now she was being told in order for my brother to make a full recovery, she had to stay with the man that injured her child. You see, my father had dismissed my brother. As we later found out, he told him in not so nice a way to get away from him, that he couldn't be bothered. So again, my mother blamed my father. I blamed myself. And any chance of a normal family life was robbed. But because my mother always put her children before her, she stayed. There were many unanswered questions as to why my father would disappear periodically. Why his mood swings were so drastic. But it didn't matter right now because my brother survived. My brother was in the 1 percentile, and he needed our help if he was ever going to have a normal life. He had been discharged from Stallworth, so the rest of his recovery was going to be based on our ability to follow the doctor's orders. I had been put into homeschool at this point, and when I wasn't helping, I was watching movies. I was watching classic movies, but I was really watching the Moulin Rouge a lot. I was fantasizing about someone coming to save me, that maybe I could be a beautiful woman one day and someone would save me from my normal life of misery and suffering. I dreamed that I could be recognized as an artist, and that I would find someone with a poetic heart that touched mine, and I would be able to fly far away. And you know, the crazy thing about being a kid is that you watch a movie like that and you don't realize you're idolizing a prostitute. Your hero is a courtesan who sings and dances the can-can. Oh, but I was so thankful that I had that movie, that I could just escape from the hell that was my life. That through all of that misfortune, I was able to find a way to dream about something. Because the truth was is that my father's behavior was getting worse. And yeah, my mother and father fought a lot. But it started to turn from verbal to physical. And any time it turned physical, you know what would happen. I'll never do that again. I'm so sorry. After enough time had passed, my mother knew she had to get away because we were so far away from people. I didn't have any friends. My brother certainly didn't have any friends. He was healing, and in that healing process, he had a half-cocked smile, is how I will describe it. The left side of his face worked, but the right side of his face did not. Throughout the course of his life, we knew that he was going to have multiple surgeries, but this devastated my mother. That though he was saved, people were going to look at him differently, though there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. All because in order to save him, they had to cut the facial nerve. But she had to get away from my father. She did it in a way that I'm still very much impressed by. She told my father that because James needed to see the doctors more frequently, that it only made sense that they got a place closer to Vanderbilt. Since Bucksnort was 2 hours away, at least where we lived, it was 2 hours. And in that time, we had acquired animals, chickens, ducks, horses, you name it, we had it. So someone had to stay to take care of the animals. and that would be my father. My mother went and got a condo in Franklin where she initially wanted us to move. And for the first time, it felt like I was breathing in air that wasn't polluted. There wasn't any toxicity. I was a little girl. I had lost my uncle. I had almost lost my brother. And I lost all knowing of who my father was. But now we were in a new place, significantly smaller, but it was ours. It was safe. When we wanted to visit the country house, we could. Things started to return to normal at that point. It was only once we got away from him did we start to heal. Even the way my father looked to me was totally different. He used to be so handsome. My father had that Italian tan skin, dark, thick hair, long aquiline nose. But since my brother's accident, it was like he started to shed the many layers of who he was. He got really skinny. His skin tone was gray, yellow, green. Always yelling. If you asked him what he was doing, he would say he was working, that he was finding houses to work on, and that he was stressed. The only reason that we didn't believe that he was working was because there was never any money coming in. There was a stark difference. Because I was a rich kid. I had everything. Now things were starting to get a little dry. Even our refrigerator wasn't filled up. So how could you be working if there wasn't any money coming in? My mother, who had been a very well-regarded paralegal in med malpractice in New York, could not get hired by any firm here in Nashville. And she was starting to get desperate because my brother needed a certain type of insurance. And she applied, man. She applied to all these different jobs and nobody would hire her. And back in the day, in the early 2000s, if you had a thick northern accent like this in a small country town, you were a fucking outcast. But finally, somebody did call her back. And it was Kroger, the grocery store. And I remember seeing my mom hysterical. But like I said before, she'd do anything for her kids. She always put her kids before her own needs. Maybe that's something that you're supposed to do as a mother, but I don't know many of them that would go to the extreme that mine went for hers. She started working at Kroger and she got that insurance. So my brother could have the surgeries he needed to have throughout the course of his life. It was a school week. I got up and got myself ready. And then I went over to my brother's room to help him get ready while my mother made us breakfast. She was going to get ready for work, but before that, she was going to drop us off at school. We walked outside, and my father's truck was still running, and he was passed out in the truck. So my mother walked over to his side and said, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" And that's when he told her that the house burnt down. I remember that sinking feeling inside of me. That yes, it was stuff in the long run. It wasn't anything of true value. But those were our things. Those were our pictures. Those were our toys. All the memories that were attached to a better way of life had now gone up in flames. But the thing that scared me the most is I knew what that meant. I knew it meant that he didn't have anywhere to go. And my mother knew that too. That if the house burnt down, that meant he had to move in. It didn't take long for the peace that I had started to get accustomed to change. The violence was back. My mother was vacant inside. My brother only had one side of his face that worked. And I resented my life. I was angry that things had changed so dramatically. It really started to unfold when my mother had found a doctor outside of the state of Tennessee in Virginia Beach, who was the first doctor to transplant nerves to reanimate facial muscles. And my mother was hyper focused on my brother getting that surgery. She needed to take my brother to Virginia Beach, and that left me and my father alone together. I didn't really have that much of a connection to him. I didn't like him. Now, we were going to meet my mother and brother in Virginia Beach. They flew out 2 or 3 days in advance for testing to see if my brother could even have the surgery. We would meet up with them. The night before, my father wanted me to pack his suitcase. And I said no. He got in my face and he told me, "You're going to pack my suitcase." I was, you know, going through my hormonal changes. And let me tell you something, maybe I wasn't pleasant, but nothing felt nearly as good as telling him to go fuck himself. I knew I shouldn't have said it, but I don't think that his reaction was warranted either. He beat me and he kept punching me, not in my face, but in my abdominal area so I couldn't breathe. And eventually he got on top of me and started to strangle me. And I'll never forget that he said in my face, as I was struggling to breathe, that I brought you into this world. I can take you out of it. And I don't know what came over me, but it was like I had the power of 1,000 men, because somehow, some way, I clocked him right in the chin. And fueled on adrenaline, I remember running out of the condo and I jumped on the fence. I climbed over it and I ran to my friend's house. And he called the cops. He called the cops on me. And I remember sitting in my friend's bedroom watching all the Williamson County cops looking for me. My friend was obviously really worried. I told him that I had to go back home at some point. And when I did, my father was crying, kind of like blubbering, Did I want to forgive him? No, I didn't want to forgive him, but I was going to rat him out anyway. I was going to tell my mother what he did. And considering that my neck had bruises all over it, wasn't going to be hard to figure out who she was going to believe. The plane ride to Virginia Beach was quiet. He didn't really have much to say, but I knew that I was going to tell my mother what he did. Actually, I believed I didn't have to tell her anything, that she was going to be able to see what he did to me. And when we got there, my mother was so joyous for my brother that he was going to have this surgery. But she didn't notice my neck. And I didn't tell her then, because I didn't want to ruin this moment. It wasn't about me. It was about James. And I was an adult now anyway. So it didn't really matter what happened to me. My brother got that surgery, and she was lucky enough to get the insurance company to cover the cost, even if it was outside of the state of Tennessee. My father's behavior had gotten worse, but we finally figured out what was wrong with him. One day, my brother had called from a stranger's phone because Dad was passed out in a parking lot, and he was with him. They were supposed to be going to work, but no, he was passed out. So my mother and I went to retrieve him and my brother. I didn't get out of the car, but I watched from the passenger seat. My mother tried to wake him up and kept shaking him, and he wouldn't get up. He was just snoring uncontrollably to the point that I could hear him from the other car. And my mother kept shaking him, trying to get him up. And that's when she found a bag of white powder. And she looked at my brother and asked him, "What is this?" And he said, "That's Dad's sinus medication. You know, he puts it up his nose." And everything started to make sense at that point, that my father was blowing loads of coke up his nose, where all the missing money was going. I don't even know how she got him in the car, but I remember watching her taking the bag of cocaine and flushing it down the toilet. And it was a lot. It was a big bag, so I don't know how much that cost. I'm guessing it wasn't cheap, because he flipped the fuck out when he finally woke up 2 days later. And my mother finally realized that it wasn't working at this point. So what was she to do? She couldn't legally divorce him, had to paint the picture of life is good for my brother. So she says, "Fuck it. I'm gonna buy a house and leave him in the condo." And she went to find out how much money they had left. Now, remember, the country house had burnt down. And though it wasn't nearly as much as what we had paid for the house, we did receive insurance money after the investigation was concluded. And even with the money they had received from that, there was only a certain amount of money that was left. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to put a deposit on a house. So somewhere between working full-time at a grocery store and dealing with my father's addiction, she was able to put that money that she essentially stole and put it on a house. A beautiful little salt block house in Franklin. It was charming, and it sat on 8 acres. So it was enough to be able to bring the animals back. It was enough to be able to have some form of normalcy And my father was going to stay in the condo. He was going to go to a rehab. Whether he went or not, I don't know. I don't think he did. If he did, let's be real here, he was trying to get another connect. But we moved and we left him in the condo. And life was good for about a month. And he showed up. And he brought a boombox with him. And the boombox started to play a Travis Tritt song. And the song was I'm a better man. Better man. And that was the first time that I chose to ruin the parade. As the song played, my anger just exploded. And I took the boombox and I threw it. Because I knew what he was trying to do. I knew he was here and he was going to stay. I knew he wasn't a better man. He hadn't been a good man in years. And I said to him, I guess you're fucking here to stay. I didn't cry this time. I just embraced the flames that enveloped me. That the little girl that was scared now had a friend in anger. I knew my mother was going to let him back, 'cause that loveless marriage was all she knew. As I'm sure you figured out, not much had changed. In fact, the situation escalated. He would go after my mother, never my brother, but he would go after my mother and he would go after me. There was one situation where he put a in my mother's mouth and pulled the trigger. It was empty and he laughed. I had started high school around this time. We were officially the poor family. What used to be a Christmas day littered with presents had now become gifts that were donated by charitable people from churches. My father had claimed Social Security. That income, along with the income my mother made in Kroger, was what we had. He had promised to get sober time and time again, but those were just tall tales. He had no want to be sober. I tried to make friends in school. As a pretty young lady, girls are mean. I don't know if they sensed the insecurity. I don't know if they sensed that my father was a piece of shit. But it didn't matter how hard I tried to make friends, it just didn't seem to work. The bullying got really intense. It was bad enough that I didn't know who I was. But it was even worse knowing that you are a social pariah. You're an outcast. And that's when I started drinking. Not because I even liked it. It was just a way to try and be accepted. When I first started drinking, I couldn't hold my liquor. And who could? It was fucking Taka vodka. You remember Taka vodka? It wasn't an enjoyable experience. The only people that accepted me and wanted to be my friends were other delinquents, so to speak. But I really tried Because if I had friends, that meant I could go to somebody's house and I didn't have to be in my house. Which, as beautiful as it was when we first moved in, I think that my mother just stopped caring. And the only time that that house got cleaned is if I wanted it to be clean. It wasn't a hoarder's house, but there just wasn't any love in it. And how could there be? When my parents had to go out of town for another one of James's surgeries with the doctor from Virginia Beach, I took it upon myself as an opportunity to make friends. And I threw a party. And I can't really get into the specifics of this party because I'm trying my best to make sure that I say the correct things on this platform. But the party got out of control. I was given a drink, and there was something in it. Eventually, the cops broke it up. Let's just say, or better yet, I'm gonna paint a description for you. I want you to imagine a white piece of cloth and take an ink pen and break the ink pen over that white cloth. That is the visual representation of what my soul looked like after that happened. And all I wanted was for people to like me, and it made them hate me even more. It made the bullying so intense that I had to go into homeschool. I didn't have a choice. And I fell into a dark depression. The only nice thing about that depression was I'd hear my mom leave. My father would grunt, get in his car, and go do what he did. My brother would go to school, and I would be alone. I started to accept that this was my life and there was no way out of it. I did my courses, and when those were over in 3 hours' time, I laid in my bed, just waiting to hear my mom come home so I could hang out with her and be with her. And that went on for about 2 years until I graduated. And then one day, my mother walked into my room. She said, I know that you want to be a model and an actress. And I didn't give you much, but I gave you looks and I gave you your brain. So I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to give you 1 month to figure out how to become an actress and a model. And if you can't figure it out within a month, I'm sending you to secretary school. That way, you can work at a record label, meet a rich man, and your life is set. But I don't think you want that. I think you're an artist. And I believe in you. Now, at the time, this wasn't like Nashville wasn't a big city. It was and it wasn't. This wasn't like a booming industry here. And I told her that. I said, I don't know how to start. I don't know what to do. And she told me, you'll figure it out. You got 1 month, kid. Or else you're going to secretary school. Which nothing really horrified me more. I felt like my intelligence was being insulted. That I would become a secretary? I think not. But I started to do my research. Like I said, there wasn't a big acting industry here, but I knew if I were photogenic, I could get seen as a model and become an actress. Something I hadn't brought up yet was that I had such an amazing relationship with my mother, to the point where my inspiration for modeling came from when she brought home a Playboy that had Farrah Fawcett on the cover. And I was a little girl. I feel like I'm always a little girl when these crazy life changing thoughts and dreams are being inspired. But I was a young kid. She brought home the Playboy. I was fascinated because the woman wasn't wearing any clothing. I remember walking over to her. She was flipping through the pages of it, and I was sucking my thumb. And I said, "Why is that woman naked?" And my mother sat down with me and we went through that magazine, and she told me that the human body is a work of art and there is nothing more beautiful than the female form. And that stuck with me. And I had it in my head since I only had a month now to make my dreams a reality. If Playboy could see my pictures, maybe I could save my life. Maybe I could save my family. I could get them away from my father. And as I continued to meet more photographers in the Nashville area, I started to get a reputation for myself, a good one. I was a working model, and I worked really hard. The process didn't happen overnight. In the time that I started dreaming and learning about myself, learning more about modeling and photography and studying Stanislavski theater, and I started to make these friends. One who is my best friend. And I kept sending these test photos to Playboy, and nothing was ever getting through. And my best friend met the cousin, or the nephew, I'm sorry, of a Playboy photographer. That Playboy photographer wanted to know her interest in shooting. And she said, it's not something that I want to do. But what if I told you I know a girl who's perfect? And my best friend in the whole world got me that connection. And she didn't have to do that, but she did. And I remember that the first time that I prayed to God, since that time in the hospital parking lot, was the night that I sent those pictures off to that photographer. Oh, and I was screaming and crying and screaming and crying and begging him. I was begging God, please, 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 please help me. This could change my life. Please, please help me. And I was angry, and I would go back and forth between being upset and scared and begging. And it was the very next day that I got that email, and they booked me a flight. And I finally started to believe in myself again. I finally believed in God again. And that was the beginning of my modeling and acting career. It was the moment in my life where I felt seen and heard. It was the first time that I ever really felt that I was beautiful. It made me realize that God was there, after all. Now, I will say This alter ego that I had created got a little out of control. I was very egocentric. I was very self centered. I thought I was hot shit. Because I was. The people that made fun of me in high school were sufficiently kissing my ass now. But I wasn't happy. Like, I thought getting modeling jobs and acting jobs and music videos and movies and everything else you could think of would change my life dramatically. And it did, but it was never enough. I was just worried that I wasn't going to achieve the things that I had set out for myself. I never valued the present moment and the gifts that were being given to me. I never took a second and said, wow, look what I did. It was actually quite the opposite. I was very impatient that the success that I was having wasn't enough, that I needed to make sure that I had the next job lined up, even if I was on set of a Martin Scorsese movie. It didn't matter that I was now going all over the world to model. I was just worried who was going to see me. When was I going to find my version of Ewan McGregor and be saved? The funny thing is that's not how the movie ends, is it? She doesn't get saved, she fucking dies. I met a guy who I thought was great, but as it turned out, I was trying to reinvent a relationship very similar to the one that my mother and father have. It was a chaotic, loveless relationship built on a need for status. And I don't blame him anymore, but he had his own addictions. That's when I really started to like alcohol. It made me feel less crazy being with him if I could just stay drunk. That relationship went down in flames. But my love of alcohol was fueled. I liked it. I liked that I didn't care when I was drunk. I was totally possessed by the darkest part of me. And I didn't want to remember the sensitive child that struggled to be popular or struggled to have normalcy in her life. I didn't want to remember her. I wanted to erase her. And as my career got bigger and bigger, I was presented with amazing opportunities. But that big mouth of mine, my inability to fake a smile or let someone grab my ass like it was okay, had reached its tipping point. I destroyed many opportunities for myself. And also, considering now what we know about Harvey Weinstein and the whole casting situation, did I really ruin those opportunities for myself? Really? But one thing I was happy about was that eventually my mother had quit working at Kroger. She couldn't take it anymore. And thank God, honestly. And she was looking for a new job, and she had become a home health care worker, which, if you know anything about that, they pay those people dick. I mean, even dick would have been better than the dick that they were serving. And she started to take care of this elderly couple in Franklin who lived in a beautiful historic home on a horse farm. Now, obviously, I don't want to waste a lot of time on this first episode. I just try to give you guys the facts. But my mother had grown up a horse girl, and she was an equestrian, and she had always wanted to get back to working with horses. And one day, these people gave her a job as a horse trainer. And I think in a way that really saved my mom. That same way that I posed for Playboy and every other major magazine that came after it was the same way that she felt that same sense of joy working with those horses. And she would retrain these horses that went to the races and would then facilitate their life outside of the races. That way they would get good homes and be loved by people who would love them as much as she loved them. And I would even go and help out. I was the assistant horse trainer on my days that I wasn't on set. And basically, if you're wondering what assistant horse trainer meant, it meant I cleaned up the shit. I was the perfect jockey height and size. So I was thrown on the horses and I dealt with them bucking and farting and throwing me off until eventually they learned to be good horses. But I didn't care because just to see her happy for the first time in years meant everything to me. But she was so happy. And that gave me joy because I was working so hard, having this single-mindedness that I was going to be famous and I was going to have all the money in the world and I would be able to save my family and get rid of my father without violence. But one day I got a phone call from my brother saying that my mother wasn't feeling good. And she wanted to say goodnight to me. And we had had a fight. We had had a fight a few nights prior. And I remember saying, Mommy, I love you. I do all of this for you. And she said to me that you are my world. And I love you so much, my precious girl. After I hung up the phone, I felt very still. My mind wasn't all over the place. I had made my dinner. I had pulled out my little eating tables. I don't know what the proper name for them would be. And my brother called me back and said, something is wrong. Something is wrong. I told him to call the ambulance, and he did. And I calmly put a coat on and got in the car and started driving towards the house. As I was driving, I still didn't have a thought enter my mind. And all of a sudden, I saw it wasn't a shooting star. It was like a falling star. And it was so massive. And it fell out of the sky. And I started to panic. Because I knew it was my mother. And I started to scream. And then the phone rang. And it was my brother. And he said, you got to turn around. They're taking her to Vanderbilt. And I fucking knew. So I turned the car around and went back towards Nashville. And I was a wreck. Those people in the waiting room knew that I was going to be a problem. And they were right. My brother got there, and I was trembling in that waiting room. My father, who was having a procedure at Vanderbilt, was rolled down. And they put us in this room and told me that my mother had had a brain aneurysm and that there was nothing that they could do. And I said, I've already dealt with brain injuries in the past. Put a fucking shunt in her brain. Drain the fluid. The doctors looked at me like I had 5 heads. I said, do it now. I looked at my father and I said, you finally killed her. She had a brain aneurysm. It was all those years she had to struggle and work like a dog. You finally fucking killed her. And then the doctors started yelling at me, telling me that I needed to calm down. Eventually, I left the room and went over to my mom and I told her everything was going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay, I promise. I love you so much. Everything's going to be okay. And for 5 days, I just waited for her to wake up. My mother was, with all her flaws, the kindest human being. And in her last act of kindness, I found out that she was a full body donor. Something that she would joke about with me. She would always say, when I die, just leave me there. I'm not in that body anymore. No funeral, nothing. Just leave me there. So you can only imagine how devastated I was. My mother and I had a very abnormal relationship in that she was my best friend. She was my superhero. She was the strongest woman I ever knew. And now she was gone. So I did the only thing I knew, which was I drank. And I drank. And I drank. To the point that I could not function without being drunk. And this went on for a year and a half. But then the pandemic hit. I got so drunk one night that I tried to dance to Wet Ass Pussy. I'm talking wop, wop, wop. All the way into the cement paver. I split my knee open and blood went everywhere. But I was so drunk that I didn't remember once I was put in the bed what had happened the night before. I woke up as if everything was normal. But when I tried to get out of the bed, that's when I realized my leg wasn't working and I fell. And that's when I saw that my mattress was covered in blood. And then I looked down and saw my kneecap. Bone is yellow, by the way. Didn't know if you knew that, but now you do. That's when I realized I had a problem. And I took it upon myself to realize that I was going to lose me entirely if I didn't clean my shit up. I couldn't remember the last time I was sober. Alcohol had been my way of numbing myself all the way up until this point. I didn't even think that I had had a poor relationship with alcohol until I realized how often I was drinking. Like when I would go on these modeling trips, I was plastered and I needed to save myself. And I remember on one of the music video sets that I was on, it was a particularly bad day for me. I had to yet again come to the rescue and save my family's house. And this was years before I decided to get sober. Bear with me. And I remember that I didn't want to be on that music video set. The morning of that shoot, I was so frustrated that I hit myself. And it was like the first and only time that I have ever done anything like that. But I beat the shit out of myself. Like I needed to get that anger out. So I took it out on myself. I just figured it was going to be the same protocol that I had done for all the other music videos I had been cast in the past. But when I got there, it was incredibly different. It actually felt more like a movie than it did a music video. And my love interest in that music video was talking about being sober and that he had gotten sober a few months prior to being there. And I just remembered how happy he was. I wasn't happy to be there, but he was genuinely happy to be there. And I felt that anger fall off of me. And I remembered that. It was almost like it was a God-inspired memory. So I made that commitment to myself that I was going to have that same happiness. And that I was going to put in the time to know myself. As I went through the process of ridding my body of the gallons of alcohol I had used to pickle my brain, I started to realize that I wasn't happy modeling and acting. And that's when a friend had said that they were starting something new at the comedy club. I had only ever entertained the idea of stand-up once. And it was the only time my mother didn't support one of my dreams. We were burning shit. I said, what would you think if I did stand-up comedy? And she looked at me and said, why the fuck would you do that? Why would you throw away all the years that you've put into modeling? Why would you throw away all the studying, learning the art of acting for stand-up comedy? What's wrong with you? So I never really thought about it again. But I went, and it became a thing where I went every time they had this new material show, because you didn't know who was going to show up. And one day it just kind of hit me that maybe she was wrong. Maybe I could do stand-up comedy. And maybe, just maybe, I could use it as a tool. Whether I became famous or not, I could just be free and say whatever the fuck I wanted. I could talk about all of the tragedies that I've been through and put some humor on it. Because I was having such a hard time processing my life. In an instant of making that decision, my life changed. I fell in love with an art again. I didn't have to rely on a casting director. I didn't have to read through a script and say to myself, oh my God, this is awful. I would have complete control over my art. And that was something that really excited me. And in this process of doing comedy and relearning myself, I finally found acceptance. A sense of acceptance that I didn't know lived inside of me. I knew that fear and anger was certainly present, but I was finally having fun. And through therapy, I came to the realization that there are these different parts that live inside of me. Carl Jung talks about the 4 different archetypes that make up the human mind, and the shadow is often the most suppressed. My shadow wanted to be a star and is a control freak. But little Alex, the inner child that I suffocated, that I abused, that I didn't love, was also present. And I'm in an interesting place in my life. I've been able to sit back and evaluate who I am today versus who I was yesterday. And what I was able to come to was that all those years I spent believing that I was alone, that no one could ever understand my story, was just so incorrect. My life's mission was to get famous and be able to support my family, find the love of my life, and have a family. And it has not gone that way. But what I can say is that I have learned to love myself. I have learned to accept myself, even my shadow, who has many fucked up things to say, especially when there's a microphone directed at her face. I love her. The importance of me telling my story to you is that I want you to know that everything is okay. And maybe we don't have the same story, but we are connected to the same source of existence. Whether you want to call it God, Allah, the universe, I don't care. Here, I'm going to wave a fucking crystal around because you know where my head is at. I don't care what you believe, because what I believe is that my God is love. And there's already such a lack of it in this world that it's not much for me to extend my love outwards to the people who need it and need to hear that I survived so you can too. I hear you, I see you, and I acknowledge you, and I love you. Whoever needs to hear that today, I want to be remembered because the depth of my heart outweighs every negative thing I could have done in my life. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to hear my story and get to know me on an intimate level that at the beginning of this I was quite terrified to show. But now I feel good. I feel unburdened. And I hope that you join me next time. And if there's anything that you take away from this, I want you to remember, only love can change the world, and it starts with you. I'm Alexandra Van Zeelandt. See you next time on Trauma Bonding.